Hi, it's Susan from Worldpeacefull, and I saw a admiral from the United States military speaking on Fox at the Lowly Institute last night, and I had to listen to his speech to what would be a more right-wing audience. These are people who are more diplomatic, who are from defence industries, so an audience that appear to be more in alignment with US doctrines. And I remember reflecting after it that the public need to be able to speak to US military personnel who are having an impact here in our country. Also, in my previous videos, I've talked about democracy, and Australia was actually one of the preeminent democracies in the world because we didn't have the baggage of establishment. We didn't have empire. So we're kind of this very small to medium-sized power in the world that's actually in an extremely difficult position, and I've been contemplating this. I'll just show you the film. I'll just pause this for a moment and I'll show you the film I've been watching. Okay, the film I've been watching is Pine Gap. Because the reason I'm looking into these things is because of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. When they came out and they revealed that citizens were being surveilled. And not only that, corruption happening within the US administration. And I lose sleep over this. It's like, oh my goodness, this is very concerning for civilians. Now, everybody has their perspective. The US Admiral, who I'll talk about in a moment, and I'll ask some questions maybe, and I certainly have some statements to make, because we have to actually live the democracy you say you're defending, and our military say they're defending, and our soldiers have defended. So it's about defending freedom. But the really deep question is whose freedom? So looking at this issue of Pine Gap, which is Five Eyes network, and the Admiral did mention that in his speech as to one of the important features of the Australian-US relationship. This is an excellent mini-series, actually. I've been quite enthralled. They have geodesic domes, and I'd like to just say that Buckminster Fuller was the creator of the geodesic dome. He wanted all of us to work for 100% for humanity, not for special interests, but it was actually to create an Earth ship. The Earth is an Earth ship, was in his thinking. And he was an inventor, an incredible inventor. This is Buckminster Fuller. He's well worth looking up. He was a genius. These geodesic domes, I'd certainly like to see them used in homeless area because of the design of the domes. They're easy to erect and people can get shelter fairly quickly. But they're also at Pine Gap. I have travelled up to that neck of the woods, and I have to laugh because on the way into Alice Springs, there's actually a little town called Wycliffe Wells, and it's got big green guys standing out the front. So these are like the ETs. And I found out there's a lot of extraterrestrial activity in this region. And of course, there'd be questions around the US and its surveillance of that, and its perhaps engagement with that. It's a base that Australians can't access. It's an American base right in the heart of Australia. Apparently, there's 3 locations around the world that the US utilises for its... the word mass surveillance comes to mind because it's really I'm just going to go slow down a bit because I'm a bit tired on the one hand, and on the other hand, I also want to get clear. The words full spectrum dominance come. It gives them an ability to listen in because they can listen in on anything. They can easily find out phone numbers. That's why people are starting to experience the fact that through the phones that people can be tracked and recorded. through these devices, also through computers, we can be tracked, also through the electricity. We have the smart meters. We've got the NBN. These are all hardware devices that enable information to flow back and forth. So one site was in Denver, from memory. Australia is another. And the UK, there is another site in the centre of the UK. I can't quite remember what was the name of the town. But nonetheless, those are the 3 sites around the world where they have real capability of surveillance. Pine Gap may well be the best one of all of them, hence the US-Australia defence relationship. Hence the fact that no one in the room brought up Pine Gap. They bring it up under the synonym of Five Eyes, which is the UK, the US, Australia, Canada. What's the 5th one? New Zealand. So these are collaborative agreements to share information. So the advantage from the Australian government point of view is it gets information, but the way I'm understanding it, because of surveillance on my own website, particularly my blogs, it's predominantly US that looks at what I'm saying and doing. I would say they share that with ASIO for sure, because I think under law they're not allowed to spy on their own citizens. So they all share it. So they all spy on their own citizens is the point. And of course this becomes problematic. I want to go still because this is a sensitive topic, I know, and they will not want me speaking like this for sure, because the public's supposed to be the observer, not the participant, whereas I want to bring democracy to the table, which means speaking visibly. Now, I know the ones I'm speaking to and about are those who wish to control information delivery, and they are well trained in how to communicate what needs to be communicated. So it's not coming from a democratic format. In militaries, it's top down, it's highly controlled, they are compliance environments. So when civilians sort of poke their heads up like me, who aren't with anyone, no group, and we just go, excuse me, knock, knock, knock. What about democracy? What about the civilians? Do we get a say in any of this? That's what I'm doing. So let me go still, and I will try and articulate this in a way that's useful to the US, to the Australian government, and also to the Australian society, because Australians have their heads buried in the sand because they're busy and it's way over their heads and they know it. And it's not their fault. They just haven't been educated. None of us are privy to any of the deeper detail, and I'm certainly not privy. I'm just coming a lot from inspiration, but I've got some knowledge and I have a lot of questions. So I'll go still. I'm going to just say things that come to my mind because I'm an intuitive. I got submarines, and that was mentioned actually by one of the Australians in the audience was talking about submarines. Okay, that came up. I don't really know a lot about the submarines. In fact, I know nothing about the submarines. The only one that pops into my mind is the Collins class, which was a failure. That's the media. So I'll just keep going still and I'll speak to this lecture of Admiral Davidson from the US High Command. He's actually heading up, I'm sure he's heading up a lot of US forces, but he's particularly shifted the focus from the Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. So closer, this is about moving their whole positioning to, or tasking comes to mind, we're learning their language, aren't we? Comes to China. But then there's issues in behind that as well. It's like, is there an enemy? It's one of my questions. Who is the enemy? All right, let's go still and see what happens. First thing I want to say is I feel love for the Americans, and I do. That came up straight away as well. So this is not an anti-anything. And I can be looked at in anti, is the way they say it, anti-American. No, I'm not anti-American. I'm actually pro-peace is what I really am. And that includes you. I want to see a strong United States. I want to see a strong China. I want to see a strong Australia as well, but I want sovereignty to be the central point here. We all talk sovereignty, but we're not honouring it. So I'll go still. The eagle and the bear comes up. I've done a blog on that, which has received a lot of attention. This was when, what I see with the eagle and the bear, this is Russia and the United States, is Trump's visit to Moscow. I've been to Moscow myself as a World Peace clown with Patch Adams. Beautiful city. The Kremlin is pretty remarkable. And you look at I actually went to the Kremlin as part of, we did some tours. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but let's just say that I'm not certain about the tensions in respect of China. And yet there are tensions in respect of China. So this could be called a divine dichotomy, I'll call it, where it's both true. Both are true. So you'll have to work that one out. Huawei, or whatever it's called, Huawei. They've also been on my blog. I've had the United States intelligence community definitely on my blog, and I've had also China, and I've had Russia. So I've got all three of them. So I've got 3 eyes. Maybe I've got 4 because Saudi Arabia is there as well. 4 eyes. That's what we call people with glasses. 4 eyes. Looking at my blogs because I'm obviously into peace. And then, I don't know, are they looking for threats? Probably. Am I a threat? No, I'm not. I'm an opportunity. I'm an opportunity. So Huawei. Well, definitely the spectrum 5G. Definitely the spectrum. That's where it's true that there's a tension between the US and China. Because the Chinese have the sub 9 megahertz spectrum. And in the IT wars, which is what this is, there are no second places. Once you've got spectrum, everybody comes onto the spectrum. Everyone's got iPhones. And this is how the whole world is participating in this, because you're addicted to your phones, which was designed into the phones. Notifications, these are all operant conditioning mechanisms so that you hear the beep and you go to your phone. It then wires the neural network as part of your behavior. It's like you get up in the morning, you might go to the toilet, you might go and have a shower, get dressed, have breakfast. You do it every day, so it becomes a pattern. And it wires in. And if you change the routine, it feels a bit weird. So people will feel a bit weird if they don't have their phone. And if all their friends are on the phone, they've got Facebook and they're constantly communicating, that is the brain being wired and becoming addicted to being responded to. Oh, someone wants to talk to me. It's like the phone ringing. Or it was like in my day, because I'm a bit older than many, 55 now. In my day, it was the postman coming. And, oh, a letter's coming. And in those days, they weren't all bills. We actually had people write to each other. And you get excited when you hear the sound of the motorbike. This is operant conditioning. They did experiments on, what do they call it? Pavlov's dog or something like that, where what they used to do is they'd give the dog some meat. Dog loves meat. Then what they'd do is ring a bell and give the dog the meat. Ring a bell, give the dog the meat. Then they'd stop giving the dog the meat and they'd just ring the bell and the dog starts to salivate because it's programmed. See, we're programs, we humans, and this is what we've all got to understand. We're being programmed. We have been programmed. This is nothing new. Education is a programming. We're programmed into a knowledge and we all believe it and we'll fight for it because it's true. But ultimately, it is an agreed upon propositions that we call true. Now, in science, of course, there's more, it's factual. In other words, when you do your experiment, it either works or it doesn't. So it's much clearer about what is true in respect of these events that are set up to trial something. So going back to Huawei, the sub-9 spectrum, the phones, also it's very important that people understand that the phones are considered weapons too, because you can upload footage, you can become a witness. The phones can be used as tracking devices, which they are, and they, it's all come ultimately from the military. DARPA is worth looking at, Defence Advanced Research Program Agency, Project Agency. Acronym is DARPA. There's also DRAPA, which is the spin-off of those involved in the government official version who are now doing their own projects in non-profits. So we've got militaries are spinning off into private sector. Very concerning because they're taking the expertise that would have had a non-disclosure on it in government, they're taking it out into industry. Industry then gets hold of this research that would have been funded by the public. It's all ultimately been funded by us, all of us, globally. And it's why it's our business, because it's being put to us that these things are being done on our behalf in order to protect the public. But the question is, who is the enemy? And that is really the question of this video. Who is the enemy? It's the same question I raised in Bangkok when I ended up with surveillance. I was a Rotary Peace Fellow, and I put that question to a Thai military counter-terrorism officer. Who is the enemy? Because the public were being water cannoned in this particular incident at Takbai. It's worth looking up. Takbai. So who is the enemy? And really, if I took it to a higher perspective, I'd say, is there an enemy? So I want to go still on this again, spectrum. The US military, and this is not coming from, this is just, I've also done reading on this, so just know that. The US also, its military operations are in the sub-9 spectrum, so the megahertz spectrum. Therefore, industry can't use that spectrum. It has to use the millimetre waves, which is higher up in the band. And that's your more what they call jagged waves. The sinusoidal waves are like that. So not that I understand all of this, I don't. But what I do know is that we are in a Wi-Fi 5G interconnected world, which the Admiral talked about. Interconnected, and he's quite right. And it's being interconnected through infrastructure projects. So this is where the battle lines are being drawn, and they talk about cyber warfare. Where anything goes, they can drop things onto a computer. I think someone just did that, a government department did that to me the other day, I'm pretty sure, because I actually saw something go across my screen like a green band. As I was seeking to upload a document, I think other stuff got downloaded because they see an enemy. They don't see citizenship. They don't see freedom of speech. They don't see democracy, because that's being whittled away at, and it's being made wrong, and it's not wrong. It's actually who we are. And it's actually the best form of national security is democracy. When we start coming into control paradigms, which the military lives and breathes, we are then subject to compliance type structures or technocracy type structures, which you basically have to say yes, and if you say no, you can't get access. Now, democracy was never set up that way. In Australia, egalitarianism was everyone has access. That's why we cross-subsidised and the government paid for infrastructure, paid for telecommunications, paid for schools, paid for utilities such as electricity, gas and water. I think the gas at the time wasn't paid for, but certainly the water and the electricity was. In the very early days, it then became metered. So government had its role by taking taxation from the public. Its role was to deliver services to the public on its behalf, because these are large infrastructures. You're dealing with millions of people. So it's only practical that the government delivers roads, installs streetlights, creates pavements. There were public assets like libraries and pools. We had many things when I was growing up. We had free public transport. It was wonderful. It was really wonderful. And I remember the energy at that time. It was really good. This was, I was born in the 60s, but Gough Whitlam was here in the 70s. And he was the one who was wanting to, I'm learning more and more, buy back our energy. He was wanting to develop our energy so that we become sovereign. He also, they say, wanted to buy back the farm, so we're dealing with minerals too. And then we had there was also discussion around Pine Gap. Now, this is not well known. He wanted to close Pine Gap. And the dismissal happened after that. There's certainly a lot of speculation. I don't know how valid it is, but certainly I've got on my blog some journalists who have talked about CIA's involvement in that. This has to be known. It has to be a card on the table facing up, because it's our country that can become a target in all of this. And that is what my concern is. So I'd be very happy for the Admiral to come out and say, well, no, that's not true. And I'd like it to be honest. I don't want it to be media spin. But I'd really like to know the truth of that matter. Was our Prime Minister removed? And the US has a lot to answer for in the world, and it does. It does. And this is not anti-nothing. This is like, we've got to talk about these matters. The situation in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, not that I'm across any of this, I'm not, but what I do know is it was massively impacting of the citizens of those countries who were innocent, who ended up becoming part of the targeting. And of course, the recent AFP defence raids on the raids that happened with the ABC. AFP is the Australian Federal Police. And then it comes to light that the target of that was a British SAS officer who was doing research into humanitarian law in respect of who are the combatants and who are not. And a sort of a widening of that definition to those who might even just be supplying food to groups that could be identified as this or that. Now, in respect of the identifying, it could be just seen as someone who's an enemy of that country because they are opposing it. This is not democracy. This is the war doctrine. And it's very problematic because it becomes very blinded. There's the enemy, there's not. And it has to be really clear about that. But then the civilians in amongst all of this, who are the ones whose hospitals get blown up, whose infrastructure gets completely destroyed. And there's no backward glance at that. As a citizen, I find that highly concerning. It may well be that those trained in this area, they've had all these histories of heroism around war. But nobody ever talks about the civilians on the ground, the children that are traumatised for the rest of their lives, families. It's like it doesn't exist. It's irrelevant. It's not considered part of the frame of reference because they are not important. They're collateral damage. They're not. They're human beings who not only have lives and families and communities and destinies, they also have many lifetimes that they live. I'm just bringing that one in because no one will. So I'm saying there's also a spiritual dimension to all of this as well. And at what point do we awaken as a species to become a much more evolved species where we work together to resolve all our problems? The climate change was brought into the discussion with the Admiral Davidson at the Lowly Institute. He didn't say much about that. In fact, a lot of his answers were not really saying hardly anything. I didn't understand any of it. Nothing clear. So we want a friendship that's based on honesty, don't we? We want clarity. We want to be empowered to make our own sovereign decisions as to whether this is good for us or not. I need to go still on this. Okay, it's a competitive game. It's like, you're on our team or you're not. You're either with us or you're against us. No. That's the competitive cultural aspect of the US. Yes, we have competition here in Australia, but we tend to be more mates, and you mentioned the word mates in the talk. Well, we really believe in equality and mateship, and that means upfront. That means sharing information, not some information, but all of it. And of course, I would say to my own government, I don't agree with you surveilling us via any Five Eyes network. There's no enemy here. The enemy is fear, in actual fact. I'll tell you the two enemies of mankind, fear and guilt. That's it. And the moment you jack up fear, you're creating your enemies. And then people believe they have vested interests in the industrial military complex. This is the industrialised military. So they're ex-military people in industry making money out of selling weaponry back to the government. We see that with contractors. You know, the contractors were once inside the government and then they contract back, and that's a very common trend in government. But what it means is there's issues around secrecy with that, and there's also issues around them developing that knowledge outside of government oversight or public oversight. So the whole private sector industry, which was referred to in this talk in respect of infrastructure projects in the Pacific, is highly concerning because it looks like the military is supporting its own industry in getting profit to make America great again under a motivation of this Chinese-US trade war. But those Pacific Islands, they don't have a lot of power. They're small countries. And what sort of infrastructure is being embedded? We've got here in Australia already the recognition of NBN as no information is lost, said Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull. So that's another way of collecting data. We've got the smart meters, which are now they're run by US companies, I noted. Not all US companies, but there's probably affiliates like in Singapore. So we've got our energy now being controlled by foreign companies, and it's being metered and it's being monitored because sensors, they pick up what activity is going on in the house. So this is, I mean, I have to be honest. It's like on the one hand, people go, communism, look at them controlling their people. This is bad. Politburo, gulag. And yet what we're seeing today is far worse. The lights have cameras in them. I was absolutely shocked when I found that out. I was totally shocked. And every time I go for a walk, I'm very conscious of these lights. Some of them are LED lights. I've only found out recently that they can be weaponised. You can target people through them. They can pick up through their antennas people's phones as they're driving along the street. So we're trackable, or they call it triangulation. It's triangulation. They target someone. This then makes the public the enemy, and it's like, no, we do not want that. This are parents, grandparents, children, disabled, young people become a potential target because of this insane surveillance apparatus that's been set up around the world. This is not going to create peace. Although it may create the backlash, which then creates peace. So yeah, it might. I'm just rethinking that. It could, and certainly inspiration has come to me to say that this unfettered capitalism, because that's what it is, and it has hold of its own government. We all know that through donations into the government. Our own rupee is very much involved in all of this in the media side. I just want to go still on that as well, because I actually had very strong inspiration around Rupert the other day. Fear comes up, really intense fear. It's the loss of empire. So industry wanting to maximise profit because it's frightened of a global collapse. But the thing is, what they're not understanding is this fear is driving these technologies like the robotics, the smart cities, full spectrum dominance. I have to put the cards on the table because I think it's all very dangerous. Probably to me, but I believe in democracy, and I guess I believe in freedom too. You know, what will be will be. This is the same control. So what you fight, you become. So you fight the commie enemy. This has been going on in the United States for a long time, and I have seen the ideology. When I was in the United States, I was really surprised because I actually went up to a soldier who was selling his book, Dogs of War it was. And I asked him an honest question. I said, what do you think will bring peace? And then he looked at me, peacenik, you know. And I was going, no, I'm not a peacenik. I'm asking you the question because peace is in all our interests. Although they would say superficially, no, it's not, because we want war in order to sell more hardware, and it's about power. We think power is what creates world order, and we think that's more secure. That would be, if we were having an honest conversation, probably what he'd say. So where I was going was, what you fight against, you actually draw that darkness into yourself. Now, you might want to look at Eckhart Tolle, A New Earth. So I'm giving you information for your highest good, actually. What you fight against, you draw into yourself as a darkness. You become the very thing you fight. And it's not just the US fighting communism. It's all of us whenever we choose to fight. These videos are not to fight that other party. They are to speak openly and honestly because we need transparency. And I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying I feel to express publicly because I have concerns. What I'm feeling is the whole militarism thing is an old dogma, that it's still trying to project power and it's losing traction. And I think that was very evident by the Philippines' decision to not give the United States, I'll just have a look at the words that I wrote down. I did a little bit of a list before. The Philippines were concerned, have had the US base there for a very long time. So it was to do with landing rights. It was visiting rights, they called it. That's right. Visiting rights. I just want to go into the Philippines. They've had a lot of disasters too. I'm just thinking Mount Pinatubo and others. Great poverty in these countries. US would give a lot of money, and this is where the bribery comes in. Give a lot of economic aid, tide aid, in order for us to have a presence. This is something else that has to be put on the table. It's not sovereignty, it's actually exploiting poor people. But they're strategically in a position that the US has deemed important because it's seeing itself as the global policeman in order to uphold wealth for industry. So the real It's not protection of the United States people, it's protection of US industry, is what I'm saying very clearly. Also, the energy issue, the cartels, the energy cartels, and the fact that the US defense military are embedded within the same portfolio of energy. The two share the same portfolio, which means those interests become energy interests. Saudi Arabia is in there. And we saw the havoc it's caused in Iraq, in Syria. Well, there was gas interests up at the north in Afghanistan. So yes, there were energy interests there. So what is being stated to Admiral Davidson with love is that the trajectory I see you going on is not about international security and peace. It's a trajectory of US interests making America great again. And I understand that. The UK would understand that. Great Britain. They fell from pole position, and the fear of the rise of China on one level. On another level, there may well be interests in full spectrum dominance, shared interests. I could be wrong on that, but that's a consideration. So the old paradigm of the militarism, in order to uphold a world order, which has been a unipolar world order for a long time, which, when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened and Gorbachev, stepped into perestroika and so forth and so on and more, and there was an attempt for private enterprise to go into Russia, and they were suppressed. Certainly some of the oligarchs in Russia were as well, in respect of oil. I just want to feel out the traditional power structures, of which, with love and respect to the Admiral, he's also West Point, being trained into this type of thinking. And what I'm trying to perhaps put here is just a way of breaking out of that box a bit with thinking that's not in your box. Now, you might see that as threatening thinking, or you might choose to actually see it as a gift that's coming to you. The latter would be more accurate. The words, we look forward to a time where the power of love overcomes love of power. Then will our world truly find peace. I wore that statement. That was Wendell Jones. I think Oliver Wendell Jones was the author of that, Power of Love. That was worn on the back of my jacket when I travelled the world as a world peace clown, when I was actually promoting peace to schools everywhere I went. And clowning in itself is actually peacemaking, because you're stepping into someone's space or sovereignty, but you're going into that space with a really strong feeling of total acceptance, full spectrum acceptance of that other, as a new strategy in peace building. You're coming at it in a very light-hearted way, not beating the chest, which is a very masculine approach. You're coming at it as a friend, in truth, but everyone's our friend. We just don't know them. Scott Ritter talked about that as the US goes bounding out there into the world, but it doesn't understand the cultures of those countries it's seeing as the enemy. And then he certainly raised here in Melbourne when he was here, that there will always be, 15 to 20 weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And it wasn't true. So there were lies that were spoken. It was about publicly stating that that war was a war that was to ensure peace and security because they were developing a weapons program. What Scott Ritter found out was that was not the case. It wasn't threatening. And instead of it wasn't a regime change thing, it was a name change. They didn't particularly like the leader. So this is breaching sovereignty, and really, when you're coming to a press club or lowly institute, in this case, think tank, and you're talking about friendship, real friends are honest. You can't talk friendship and mateship and conceal from Australians the truth of what you're actually doing and the fact that you have not resolved the past. You're still going forward, advancing energy interests, knowing that that's impacting climate change. And that was a question that was put to you about climate change. You didn't answer it sufficiently. There's also the munitions. Major Douglas Rocky, whom I heard speak here in Melbourne, who was the head of the depleted uranium project in the Pentagon, who was going around the world whistleblowing. He was talking about the depleted uranium dropped in places like the Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan. Probably, I don't know if it happened in Syria, I hope not. But the great cancer that was causing. And not only that, it had a half-life of 4 billion years. I mean, that type of mentality is destroying our planet. Nuclear, 2,000 nuclear underground tests. We've got cancer in the world. Why? I've got cancer. This is cancer. At what point will the militaries, and not just the US military, but inclusive of who are dominant military, your actions in respect of health around the world, the cracking of atolls through plutonium-type bombs, big bombs. We've had the UK and the US here in Australia, in Woomera. Massive radiation floated across Queensland. People don't even know this. It was shocking. Weapons testing in our country, and here we are again in a situation where we could become piggy in the middle in this battle. We've got 8,000 troops up in Darwin, rotating for 8 years, I believe, is what the Admiral said. They're setting up at the north so that if there's any incoming, it's like our country's been put at risk because of our ideological links to the United States, which are private interests links, private sector beliefs. Because what we're seeing, certainly in the US politics, is the private sector entering politics. We're seeing it now as well. It's just not as obvious. So they're not going into politics to represent the American people. They're going into politics to represent industry interests. And then it would be argued that, well, they have to do well in order for everyone else to do well, trickle-down effect. But what we're seeing is massive disparities with income inequality. I saw the low amounts of pay in the United States, $8 to $10 an hour. This is nothing. And that casualisation of work's coming here into Australia. You've got insurance on everything, but the poorest people can't access these things. So we've got inequality. This is not democracy. This is inequality, creating these massive gaps which create tension within the society because people feel that their value is accorded to what they own. And that's how materialism or greed changes us. See, Australia was egalitarian. I've grown up with it. We didn't look down our nose at someone because they were in a poor area. In fact, when I was growing up, I didn't come across hardly any poor areas. It was like, I can't remember one suburb. That's egalitarian. That's what it looks like. You're all on the same page. You don't even think about it. If somebody went to university or went to a private school, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. Although at the time I didn't know that gave them entree into higher positions. So the class system was created in the structure. But the point I'm making is this economic growth is benefiting the few. We've got 1% of the global elite who have access, or they own 40% of the assets of the world. I mean, that's serious concentration of wealth. UK and US. Of course, China's obviously expanded its growth given it's got a low-income population and a lot of them. What is it, 1.6 billion? It's a lot of people. In a world of 6 billion. maybe pushing 7 billion. So if we're looking at the world and we're looking at international peace and security, this is not going to create it. Full spectrum dominance through smart cities is not going to create peace on Earth. It's actually going to create a surveillance state, capitalism, surveillance capitalism it's called, which obviously the militaries are all for, because then they can control through knowing. But is that going to create peace, and is it going to ensure we have a world that survives? You might want to think about your own family, children, grandchildren. What will the grandchildren inherit in this type of world? You might say, oh, they'll be fine. Well, you don't know that. Your grandchildren might be the ones who are dissenting and who get targeted because they're not saying yes, because they actually want to be free to make their own choices. This is what love does. Makes people free to make their own choices. That's where democracy came from. Great love. It was an enlightenment. We had the enlightenment here on the planet. There was an enlightenment that took place, which was all about these words of freedom. They're not just words. When you make these speeches, you have to really deeply consider the words you're saying. Now, to address that lowly institute a bit more, so they're moving into what they're calling the Indo-Pacific, which is our region. I also want to talk about the trade relationship. $1 trillion is the trade relationship between the United States and Australia, was mentioned. 400 billion of that is Australia's trade with the US. That's an approximation. And if I heard it correctly, 600 billion was the US trade with Australia. Well, my first question there is the US companies that are actually based here in Australia who are starting up robotics, smart cities, sensors, and the industrial military complex, which is predominantly US big companies, which have their own minister for industries here in Australia. So foreign companies have their own minister here, which is in government. That is my real concern, is how on earth did military industries get their own minister when they're not Australian? Now, they might be registered here as Australian companies, but ultimately the money that goes to them is going into a military effort, which has its own agenda. It's not about protecting Australian sovereignty. 400 billion is a lot of money for 24 billion people. 600 billion is not a lot when you're looking at a population of 300 million, but that 300 million don't even know where their money's going. Most of them are not voting. So we're in a real quandary. The civilians on the planet are in a real quandary. What do we do? Then we've got transhumanism, fusing technologies into the human form. We've got bloody Elon Musk talking about, I saw this on ABC the other day, talking about technologies in the brain, Them using tattoos as a form of chipping. I mean, this is your Brave New World scenario. It's extremely worrying from a civilian point of view. They had tattoos that were chips. You can scan using your arm. You go, oh, that's handy. Well, no, it means wherever you go, you're trackable. And if it's in the brain, they're actually able to monitor the brain. I'm assuming because what they were saying they were able to do was to, through the brain, think something and make something happen. So you don't need a Wi-Fi network, although maybe they do if it's embedded in the brain. I'm not sure how it works. But they love the idea of superhuman strength, powers. They want superpowers. I got that from Talisman Sabre when I researched the word talisman. Superhuman power. But they're not tapping into 5D, which is through meditation, to get the expanded power of what you think about, you bring about, because they've not become still enough or peaceful enough to do it. So they're trying to use technology to emulate those superhuman powers. I see a lot of it as emulation of the potential of the human condition to actually reach to heights, but through freedom, through stillness, through peace, through love. Yes, the very hippie things that everyone goes, oh, hippies. No, the hippies were smart. Hippies were onto it. New Earth Army was, you know, inspired by the hippies, the New Age community. There's power there, of course. And that they'll be seen as another enemy because that's how the mindset thinks. Sees anything that is powerful in its eyes as a threat when it's not. It's not at all. If we all came together, we could, utilise for the common good, but are we after the common good here? So these technologies embedded in the brain is to try and be able to affect a device from a distance so it looks like you're psychically controlling it. So there is, at a very deep level, a desire to actually have these superhuman powers that were in the New Age movement. I don't know if the New Age people could actually affect, well, they can manifest things. I mean, the New Earth Army, which was a military unit in the US, they talked about manifesting of things in your hands. They stopped a goat's heart through focus. But this is, using these things for a negative, not good. And that's the worry. So I'm going to finish here because it's gone for a while and I have to get going. I want to just focus on Admiral Davidson for a moment, with love, of course. See, I feel sorrow there as well. Concealment, part of his job. A lot of worry, a lot of responsibility. And I feel family too. I feel I want to hug him. It's not easy what he's doing. The question is, who are you defending? Who are really being protected here? And of course, there's conflict within the military and the CIA and the FBI and the NSA. There's conflicts that are creating deep divisions. Deep state is one of them. The world going in a direction that's very problematic. This is not security. This is insecurity, rampaging, and trying to harness control through technology, and it's not going to work. You have to do the hard work of peacemaking, and that's hard work, believe me. You have to go inward. So this is for you. You have to question your thinking. The work of Byron Katie, I would take you there, and it's about you questioning your own thinking. It's not me questioning you. It's about you have to be clear with you. Is this really what you want? Is this true? And if it turns out to be true for you, then go for it. But you have to question it. Questions are absolutely essential. It can easily get out of hand. This can easily get out of hand. And when it gets out of hand, we don't want that. See, my work in empowerment was to empower people to deal with their own internal conflict, because that internal conflict becomes projected outward into external conflict. And we can have very strong views about what we're taught, but they're not who we are. And there's an uncomfortableness that sits there because we're actually not in alignment with our own truth. In order for things to manifest in the way people are wanting, they have to be in alignment with their own truth. Because the universal intelligence, if you like, if you don't mind me using cosmic terms, only responds to what you truly believe. Fear is where the seeds of destruction come from. Fear is false evidence appearing real. There's nothing to fear but fear itself. And when we go into fear, we're easily manipulated, and and that includes those at the top as well. We easily hand our power over because of this narrative that's been unquestioned. It's not about making America great. America already is great in its own way, as is Australia great, as is China great. Every country is great. The UK is great. Saudi Arabia is great in its own way. Your greatness does not come from materialism. Your greatness comes from your compassion. It comes from your sovereignty. It comes from your leadership and visionary. It comes from your incredible innovation, but for the common good. The people see the greatness in you when you truly do things of with selfless intent, where you truly are serving the greater good. When you come into alignment with that, the greatness is there. The superpowers is more an extension of ego, and it comes from deep insecurity of not having power. It's coming from powerlessness. So to be great again means you don't feel great. You feel you've fallen. But if you're cleaving onto material things and economic growth as greatness, it's never going to work, because the greatness is in the spirit of humanity, and it comes from selflessness. That's what it really is. That's what greatness is. What else do I need to say? You are loved. Everyone is loved. Find your truth, the real truth. Dismantle the structures of fear if you want true security. Get to know cultures. Come to them as friends. Don't plant seeds of division to turn this against that, because that's part of your training. Don't allow militaries to be used by interests who have no care for the people, because it's their money that's being used. This situation requires extremely deep contemplation. You need to find silence and then go from there. We have to make peace if we're to survive. That's my message. I send you peace, and I send you love and illumination. You say God bless. We're all blessed, including your enemies, because there is no enemy. Take care. Bye.